Yes, the business environment. Well, it has been a game of many halves, if you like, for businesses around the country. If you're in the primary sector, your prices are gangbusters, and the hardest thing you've got to do is find the people to do the work to get your product to market. Similar story in construction, although that may change with the Reserve Bank's efforts this last day or so, and their signalling of a 3.4% OCR. Then you have the tech sector, who are struggling to bring what we might have used to call manufacturing in a way, but it's now very much high-tech IT and so on, struggling to get the people to continue their growth. And then the sector that's done it toughest at all, and that's the services sector, and in particular people providing human services, tourism, education, getting a haircut, hospitality, and they are absolutely struggling, some to the point of closing their businesses either permanently or temporarily. And that's the nature of this pandemic. Layered over the top, though, the government has its own regulatory reform agenda, particularly in the resource industry sector and climate change and the environment and so on, and also in the labour market, where they have planned significant changes to unfold in the next couple of years. To help us navigate this in this next session, I have three guests who know exactly what they're talking about, very knowledgeable and right in this wheelhouse. Firstly, Craig Renney, who's Economist and Director of Public Policy at the New Zealand Council of Trade Unions. We have Mike Burrell, who's the Executive Director of the Sustainable Business Council, and we'll follow them up with Bryan Chapple, who's the Deputy Secretary, Macroeconomics and Growth at New Zealand Treasury. So welcome, gentlemen, and we'll start with you if we can. Craig, I think you're there. Yes, there he is, and g'day to you. What we'd like is from everybody is just sort of 5 to 7 minutes of laying out your stall, the key points you want to make, and then we'll get to the conversations and the questions where we get to talk it about amongst ourselves, which I think is probably the highest value part of the session. So Craig, welcome, and fire into it.
Thank you, Stephen, for that introduction. I hope you'll continue to be as kind at the end of my speech. And I'd also like to thank Waikato University for providing with me the opportunity to talk with you today. We've been asked to talk about navigating a changing regulatory environment for businesses. And for me, let's be clear, all governments regulate. They regulate because they perceive a problem in the economy or society that requires rules. They regulate to correct the balance. As Professor van der Heijden, the chair in regulatory practice at Victoria University, states, proper regulation is not about restrictions or limitations, but rather about providing equal opportunity and protecting individuals from harm. Sometimes this works. The creation of ACC was essentially the creation of a set of regulations. It means that those who have accidents receive support, and we don't have ambulance chasing lawyers on TV. New Zealand is arguably much better off as a consequence. Sometimes it doesn't work. The leaky homes crisis was caused by regulation failure. As Mr. Joyce will tell you, it's cost the government $12.5 billion to fix and will continue to cost more in the future. Poor regulation, or the poor application of regulations, can cause real harm. And there are few areas of life that regulation does not touch. From the quality of the air we breathe, to the nutrition of the food we eat, to the slightly more terminal 1973 crematorium regulations, they are ubiquitous. But they are necessary. I haven't heard what my fellow panelist Mike Burrell is going to say today, but I would be astonished if he didn't say that further government action was necessary on climate change. Action is necessary because for too long, we thought that our atmosphere was just a free good that didn't require regulation. The concern that some of you may hold is that now is not the time to be making further changes to regulations, that our recovery from COVID will be freshened up if we just pared back rules, that we should be cognizant of the overall burden of regulation. As my former boss, Bryan Chapple, used to tell me, we should take a system-wide view of regulation. Whilst doing so, we should not forget that according to the World Bank, New Zealand is the best country in the world to be a business, with the most business-friendly regulations. In my view, regulation is a tool. It's a tool to help you deliver the kind of economy you want to see and to manage poor behaviours. The government's economic plan calls for the building of a more productive, sustainable and inclusive economy. And its overall aim is to improve the well-being of New Zealanders and their families. The CTU backs that aspiration, as I would hope many of you here today. The volume of regulation or the level of regulatory change provided is actually pretty unimportant. What is important is that regulation effectively implemented helps to deliver on that policy aim. That's why it's right for the government to be delivering on its agenda for regulatory change in industrial relations. Even with unemployment at record lows, we can still point to sectors where job insecurity, low wages, poor terms and conditions are rife, where the costs of competition are loaded onto workers, and where health and safety is not the priority it should be. That's why fair pay agreements are essential to deliver both better workplaces and sectors more focused on product innovation and higher productivity. That's what we see now in both Australia and Germany that already have sector-level bargaining. That's why social and employment insurance is essential. Both the CTU and Business Union have endorsed the proposals because there's an opportunity to build a better way. Much like we did with ACC. According to Motu, wage scoring costs workers $15 billion in a recession year. According to NZIER, employers' number one problem right now is a lack of access to skills. We have a skills mismatching problem that the current system creates and entrenches. Social insurance will provide better opportunities for upskilling and career transition, and it will encourage the sort of equitable structural change missing from New Zealand's economic history. It's exactly the more dynamic labour market many economists have called for. This is why the government's reform to regulations around worker exploitation are essential. Some workers operate in a grey area where they're treated like employees but considered self-employed. Misclassified workers miss out on basic employment rights, payment of at least the minimum wage, holidays, paid leave, and the right to a proper process if fired or made redundant. This harms workers. It also puts at a disadvantage those businesses doing the right thing. The race to the bottom just creates an environment in which product and service levels are of second-order importance to cost, and it passes on the cost of that lack of regulatory clarity to others in the form of higher in-work welfare and tax credits. Now, reasonable people can disagree about what the government is doing, but it's been elected to deliver on its agenda, and that also means the delivery of regulation that it believes will deliver on that outcome. In my view, the business community and workers in New Zealand have nothing to fear and plenty to gain from these changes. So how can businesses best navigate these changes? My answer is engage. Engage with workers and their representatives to make the most of the opportunities these changes will bring. An example here would be the high-performance, high-engagement work commenced by Christopher Luxon at Air New Zealand, now being rolled out elsewhere. Working together with unions, it delivered higher output, lower cost, and a safer company. As Mr. Luxon called it, it was about ending the Punch and Judy show between workers and management. Leading firms recognise that understanding their regulatory environment is as much a part of their business as their product or service. And according to the 2020 New Zealand Consumer Survey, it's also increasingly part of what customers and clients want too. That survey said it was becoming increasingly important for businesses to ensure they are meeting their legal employment standards and to have the appropriate systems in place to ensure worker well-being. But let's go back to Professor van der Heyden to end. As he said, regulation is not about restrictions or limitations. It's about providing equal opportunities and protecting individuals from harm. The proposed changes to industrial relations in New Zealand help level the playing field. They're also about reducing the harms and rebalancing the costs that we see from the current regulatory systems that we have in place today. More importantly, they're also about delivering on the government's economic goal of that more productive, that more sustainable, and that more inclusive economy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Craig. I'm sure there's much for discussion there. One thing I do think we can probably all agree on is the aspiration. I've never doubted the aspiration on both the left and right of the political spectrum to deliver a more productive and equitable economy for this country. The challenge is, of course, the method by which it's done, which we will discuss over the course of the next 30 odd minutes, 35. Let's go then to Mike Burrell, who's the Executive Director of the Sustainable Business Council, and that, of course, related to Business New Zealand. Mike, I'm sure will have a few things to say on what Craig's said, but also is particularly interested in the whole resource area, environmental concerns and climate change. So, Mike, g'day.
G'day, thanks, Stephen. Well, look, I think it won't come as any surprise to anyone who's listening to that today that I'll be looking at this through a sustainable business lens to start with at least. And I just really want to make 4 points. The first one is that in many countries, including New Zealand, businesses are leading the way on sustainability and climate action. So sustainable businesses like the ones I represent in the Sustainable Business Council have been moving from seeing sustainability as a bolt-on, something that you do in addition to your core business, to seeing it as something that should be built into your core business strategy over the last 5 years. And we're seeing more of that turn up in those business strategies. So these businesses see that it's just good practice, since sustainable business is about foresight. It's about looking ahead to anticipate risk and opportunity, and then responding to those elements that are material to your business. So this mainstreaming of sustainability is evident both internationally and here domestically, and we see it across a broad range of sectors. But we're also seeing pressure coming from within the private sector as investors like BlackRock begin to signal that they'll disinvest from companies that aren't sustainable, as customers and clients begin to demand more sustainable businesses, as credit rating agencies like Moody's and Standard & Poor's now front load their conversations with companies with a session on sustainability and climate risk. You see banks like Westpac and others who are developing sustainable finance products, and insurance companies like IAG and others who are beginning to focus on climate adaptation. So a lot of the pressure on companies is coming actually from within the private sector itself. And as we've seen in countries like the UK, it is the action from the private sector that's having the most significant impact on climate emissions reduction. And this is largely being led by businesses themselves because they see both the risk of not taking action and, of course, the opportunity of adapting to that new reality and the risk of not taking action and their competitors taking it for them. The second point I wanted to make is that we're currently in the midst of a very major policy shift on climate action, the point that Craig just made before, both globally and also here in New Zealand. And it's an enormous amount that's happening in terms of climate and sustainability-related regulation and government policy. And really what I wanted to do was just list a few of those things to give you an idea, a flavour of just the scale of it. So we've got the reform of the RMA. We've got the outcomes of the Climate Change Commission's report, which came out last year, and the government's response to that through the draft emissions reduction plan. And that includes, of course, finalising emissions budgets for the next 15 years, which, of course, are critical because they set the trajectory and determine whether or not we'll meet our climate goals or not. And for that reason, of course, they need to endure across governments and so need to have bipartisan support so that they're based on independent advice and science and don't go backwards and forwards. The work that's emerging from the Worker Exploitation work that's to reduce agricultural emissions is another big piece of work that's coming down the pipe. There's the introduction of mandatory climate-related financial disclosures led by the ERB, and of course there's the development of the National Adaptation Plan, which is I think coming out in a couple of months' time. Now, in other like-minded countries like the UK and many other countries in the EU, that work unfolded over quite a long time frame. But here in New Zealand, it's happening in a very short time frame, largely because we're playing catch-up and across a wide range of areas against the backdrop of the global pandemic and the associated economic challenges that were outlined earlier. Which is why, my third point, is why partnering with business and the development and implementation of all of that policy is critical if we want to avoid the kinds of economic and social shocks that we saw in the 1980s and 1990s when we didn't anticipate what the intended and unintended consequences might be of those reforms. So our view is that it's really important that this work is sequenced and that we work at a pace that New Zealanders can adapt to. Otherwise, we risk harming New Zealanders in the process or triggering a backlash because we've not brought the public along with us. So we think that government has a critical role in setting a regulatory environment that encourages businesses to make those investments necessary for low carbon transition. They also have a role for making some investments themselves, particularly when it comes to the just transition, R&D and other infrastructure. But what we've seen in other countries like the UK is where the enabling role of government is there, you see a massive investment by businesses in decarbonisation. And in fact, well over 70% of the reduction in emissions in the UK has actually come out of the private sector. We see a just transition starting with a conversation about where the impacts are most likely to be felt and ensuring that government is working in partnership with businesses and communities to mitigate those impacts so that we don't see what we saw happen back in the 80s and 90s. So this is a climate emergency, and so urgent actions needed, but we need to ensure that the unintended consequences of those actions aren't harmful, and we think the way to do that is to learn from those who are ahead of us, like the UK and others, and to work across government, business and communities. My fourth point is that when it comes to climate action, we need to learn how to walk and chew gum at the same time. We already live in a world that's 1.1 degrees warmer than it was at the start of the Industrial Revolution. So climate change is already here. And even if we take the action necessary to limit warming, it's likely that by the end of the century, we'll be living in a 1.5 degree world for a period of time until the impacts of our actions are felt in global cooling. This means that we need to work on both climate mitigation, that's reducing emissions, and climate adaptation at the same time. And many businesses are just getting their head around reducing their emissions, and now they've got to get their head around how they adapt to this climate that's going to continue to change for at least the next 50 years or more. So we've kicked off some work in this area in the anticipation of the draft National Adaptation Plan, and we anticipate that the impacts on climate adaptation will be every bit as significant for New Zealand businesses as climate mitigation has been. And so being able to take action on both mitigation and adaptation is going to be really important. for business. But that's all I'm going to kick off with today, Stephen, and looking forward to the questions and answers that come after this.
Thanks very much, Mike. Comprehensive view on the impact, particularly of climate change, in a very short space of time, so well done. Now, Bryan Chapple from the Treasury, our second Treasury Speaker of the day. We had the Secretary Carolee in earlier, Bryan. I suppose, interested from a Treasury perspective, you've just heard sort of two passionate discussions about firstly the labour market and then climate change from two different perspectives. What's Treasury keeping an eye on in all this environment?
Cool. Thanks, Stephen, and kia ora koutou. And I'll try not to contradict my boss, as you've helpfully pointed out. She spoke earlier. Look, I'm not going to presume to tell businesses how to navigate the environment, but I do think there's a few kind of themes that are going on here, and it's kind of useful to think about the types of regulation that are happening differently. But first, I do just want to pick up on something you said at the beginning, Stephen, about COVID, and just acknowledge that it's having very different impacts on different types of businesses. And I don't think I've seen as a sort of such extreme heterogeneity in different parts of the economy in my career. So I think we do have to be really cognizant of that when we're thinking about regulation and the way in which it's going to land, right? It's not, we can't go back to some of these kind of one-size-fits-all type approaches and kind of think that because on average the cost benefit says it's positive, it's kind of positive, because the impacts are going to be really quite different. Just thinking about the two areas that Craig and Mike have talked about, I think they're quite different in nature. So the labour market ones, and I'd include immigration in there, they're sort of one-off. I think of them as one-off. There's a whole lot of them, but they're kind of a big set of changes, maybe a shift in the pendulum, if you like. And, you know, then business can kind of, you know, whether they like it or not, can kind of get on and operate in that new environment. And there's kind of certainty about what that is, right? As I say, whether or not you agree with them, there's kind of certainty. I think the key thing we've been thinking about there is just the scale of those changes at once, and how do we make sure that they don't undermine, you know, the ends that they're trying to achieve, which I think, as you said as well, you know, we all kind of agree with the ends, the aims, but, you know, with a lot of things happening all at once, it's quite difficult to work out what that end impact is going to be and how all this is going to play out. So that's the way we're approaching those issues. I think the resources and climate ones are different in that they are the start of a longer term trend. I think we're going to see ongoing change in those areas as we get to grip with the kind of transition that we're going to see. And I think in part that, you know, that's kind of about ensuring our economic model is sustainable for the long term. And I think of it as pricing externalities and just getting those underlying incentives right for the economy. That's the sort of basic approach I take. The other kind of point I'd make about that is for both climate and adaptation, climate mitigation and adaptation, you've got to think about both the transition costs and what the endpoint's going to be like. So the Climate Commission modelling suggested that the endpoint for the economy won't be all that different from what it would have been without this transition. Yep, there's a bit of a negative impact, but it's not, well, it's well within the margins of error of any kind of economic forecast going up to 2050, let's put it that way. But what we haven't really focused on or talked about is how are we going to share the burden of the transition cost across the private sector, both business and individuals, and also across the government. Clearly, government's going to fund some of it, and some of it is going to be both incentivising the change and compensating some of the people who are losers on the way through or who are adversely impacted on the way through. But I think most of the burden is going to fall on the private sector via a mix of both kind of relative price changes and regulation. But importantly, even where the government does fund some of these things, it's really important that we are altering relative prices so that those, to support that underlying investment. Otherwise, you're really like King Canute, kind of standing there trying to fund something, and the underlying forces in the economy are pushing you in a different direction, and kind of that way lies madness. So I think it is really important. My biggest kind of, I guess, piece of context or way of thinking about this massive climate and resourcing change we're undergoing is to think really hard about the underlying relative prices and sort of incentives and economic signals that we need to be sending for the long term, and get those clear so that then people can start operating in a coherent way. And although I said we're not really going to get certainty about how all this looks, at least you can start getting some sense of direction from that. The final sort of kind of observation I'd make about the regulatory changes is, as Craig pointed out, governments are elected and have a mandate to make changes in particular areas they want to do. And my job is to give them some really good advice and then enthusiastically help them do whatever it is they decide to do. And that's the nature of the role. But I think, for people like me, it's really important we have a really good understanding of the impacts on business, and more so than usual, the impacts on different types of business and how that's going to vary across, given the COVID context, and then communicate that clearly to ministers so they make their decisions. I think the other kind of observation I'd make is that within the, within that regulatory change, there's often a lot of tiny little details, decisions that get taken that make quite a difference to the actual costs on the ground for businesses. And often we can make quite a difference to those without, even while going in the direction the government's chosen to do and achieving its broader objectives, you can make things much more simpler and straightforward for business to do that if we can work together on some of those implementation details better. And there's any number of examples where we don't get that done well, and some where we do. So I think that is, just echoing Mike's plea for business stakeholders and government to work together to make it work. And just finally, a point on the broader business environment. Clearly, free flow of people is going to be very important too, and no doubt that's something that'll be touched on throughout the rest of the 2 days. But I'll stop there, Stephen, and let you lead us through a discussion.
Thanks very much, Bryan. That was great. And to all our speakers. Just before I go back to the other panel members, one of the things Carolee was asked about this morning was this whole question of who measures the costs and benefits of different regulatory initiatives and who's there looking at the cumulative effect. And you mentioned it in relation to the labour market. As you and I would both know, relying on individual agencies to come up with robust cost-benefit analyses and so on is variable, if we could put it that way. And so there is a role for Treasury, but I've also realised that Treasury is got to be a mile wide and an inch deep, really, because you're covering the whole of government activity. Have you thought and have you considered, for example, on labour market reforms, immigration and so on, of perhaps putting together a more sort of, given that that's a big area of government activity, a more sort of robust group of people with a specific, whether you call it a task force or whatever, with a specific mindset of understanding those cumulative effects better before they all happen?
No, but I think that is something we need to think about. I think that, one area where I've seen government try to do it is on the agricultural sector, where again, a lot of these environmental changes are kind of hitting. But we have kind of thought about it in the slight abstract way in the labour market, but not in that kind of comprehensive way. Part of the challenge of doing it is that the way in which even the labour market regulations will affect businesses will vary quite a lot between businesses. So, if you're a minimum wage or sit close to that retail business, for example, that's going to be very different than if you're a tech business kind of thing. So it's hard to do. Okay,
great, thanks. Let's stay with the labour market then for the moment. And Craig, obviously as a representative of workers in terms of CTU and so on, you'll obviously be keen to ensure that everybody still has lots of work. There's a theme running around in some business circles, which is that we could be careful, we could break the sector a little bit if we rush too hard. And I know you did address that a bit, but I think it is a concern and also potentially a concern about the competitiveness of international facing businesses. And I suppose the unique aspect of this country is just how small and thinly spread we are. And I think of regional businesses, where you're the local pub or whatever, and you really are, you're struggling to just make a buck. And I suppose from the CTU's perspective, understanding the direction you want to head down and what the government wants to do, but do you think about these potential externalities and potential risks to perhaps particularly regional areas and so on from such things as the fair pay agreements?
Thanks, David. Yeah, certainly. The CTU wants as many people to be employed in good work as is possible. So we want a minimum wage which supports the aspiration of having as many people to be in good work as is possible. And that applies equally across the country. Fortunately for us, the evidence on things like the minimum wage from overseas and from other jurisdictions is that for every 10% increase in the minimum wage, general prices rise by 0.4%. So, the evidence on things like the minimum wage increases is quite small in terms of price rises, but it's certainly one of the things we take into consideration. In terms of fair pay agreements, and the proposal that's on, as I understand it, that's being discussed, has the possibility of providing for regional or local variations, and they will be sector-led agreements, which will be freely bargained between employers and employees to commence with. So they'll be dealt with from bargaining sides on both sides. So and clearly the employment impacts of whatever goes into a fair pay agreement will clearly one of the things that we'll be talking to the bargaining sides for trade unions on. But I'm sure it's one of the considerations that unions will be considering in helping to set a fair pay agreement for an occupation or a sector.
Okay, thanks. Mike, what's your feedback from members? I mean, obviously your direct interest is Sustainable Business Council, but you also have an involvement in the wider Business New Zealand setup. What's your feedback from members at the moment in terms of the pace of regulation? And I appreciate it might be different from the big end of town to the little guys, your chambers of commerce and EMAs and so on. Not so little, the EMA, but anyway, but all that. What's your read of the temperature check of businesses at the moment?
Yeah, maybe I'll start with the area that I just talked about. I think the sense on the sustainability side of regulation is that there was a lot of catching up to do, and that some of that stuff had been on agendas for quite some time. The RMA reform was one of them that was on the to-do list, I think, of a range of governments over the years. And so, that's accepted that that's going to be some pain for hopefully a good outcome. And same with the work on emissions, that there was a bit of catching up to do. We'd fallen well behind our peer group, particularly the UK and others, and there was some catching up to do there. I think the concern is just with the breadth of it. It's happening all at the same time and at a really challenging time. This is a time where companies are, fearful for their own survival in many cases. And so one of the things that we've talked to the government about is the Be Kind strategy, which is we're really keen for this to happen. We've done not a lot for the previous 30 years. We're now trying to cram 30 years worth of work into 2. We would rather see that happen at a slightly slower pace. Now, we're not saying don't do it, and we're not saying don't lose the momentum. We're just saying make sure that you do it at a pace that people can keep up with, that the companies can keep up with, particularly the small end of town, because the larger companies have a bit more to go on this. I think the question that you asked, Bryan, earlier is a really important one, which is what is the cumulative effect of what we're doing here? And I think the answer is I'm not sure any of us really know, because we're doing a lot of quite significant reform all at the same time, with the backdrop of the largest crisis that the planet's seen probably since certainly the oil crisis in the 70s. Possibly you'd have to go back to World War II to see something that's as significant. So the truth is we don't know, and I would like to see some work done on what the cumulative impact of this will be, because I think then we can make some choices about sequencing. What do we do and at what time? I worry that what we'll do is we will do a classic New Zealand thing of trying to rush it all through, and then we will spend years trying to unpick some of that and do it better. And what I would rather do is we do it, my father's adage, measure twice, cut once. And I'm not talking about years here. I'm just talking about, the next year, 2 years. I'd like to see some sequencing there. The other thing that we are seeing is that the issue of, when we ask our members what the biggest issue on their mind at the moment is, in fact, we go out to New Zealanders generally and ask them about that. In the top 10, 5 of them are about standard of living. They're about affordability. It's interesting. They're really crowding out. In fact, of the top 5, 4 of them are economic. And that's a huge difference from 2 years ago. And so what we're having to do as an organisation is kind of tilt into that area around, if you like, the the social part of ESG. You know, normally we're more focused on the environmental. Now we're realising that actually the impact on people's lives of just the last 2 years really has been really significant. So what we're hearing from our members, and I see it as being part of the broader Business New Zealand network, is just that the social and economic cost of this crisis hasn't really come to bear yet. Let's be honest, we've been shadow boxing COVID up until now. It hasn't actually been here. Now we're about to experience the real thing. And so we're watching that carefully and making sure that we go at a pace that our businesses can adapt to.
Thanks very much, Mike. A couple of our questioners have come up with questions which I might introduce at the moment, which reflect a theme that a couple of you have raised already, which is the quality of implementation of policy. One particular question about the current credit legislation, which suggests that in implementation it hasn't been that stellar, I think is probably the term. And I think there's certainly some appearances that that's indeed the case. And you'd have to say, looking at that one, there were plenty of people saying ahead of time, hey, pull up, there's going to be a problem here if you proceed on this basis. And so there was no shortage of people prepared to offer a view, but for whatever reason it didn't quite make it through to the minister's table. And therefore, and probably using that as an example of the wider question of implementation, how good are we at it really, and what could we do better, beyond just talking to each other? Because sometimes people talk, and I've been at select committee, submissions arrive, they're very good submissions, well argued, and they sort of go into a big box, and the minister charges on regardless, and that's on both sides of politics, he said quickly. So how do we do that bit better? Because with a lot going on, the risk has got to be pretty high. Let's start with Bryan as the man in the hot seat, and then we'll go to Craig.
Yeah, so I'm not going to talk about the Triple CFA in any detail and just let that play out for the time being, but I agree with the general point. If I think about recent regulatory failures we've had around health and safety, the leaky building, the finance company one, that I was involved in some of the aftermath of in the past, and the GFC. A lot of those are actually not so much about the frameworks we've had, but about the way we've ended up doing kind of enforcement and kind of the back end, the frontline stuff. I think we have actually got a lot better at that. So there's been some stuff that actually was probably started when you were involved in this, Stephen, like GREG, professionalising some of the frontline regulators, giving them qualifications and things like that. So I think there are things that are happening there, but it has been a bit of a weak spot where we've tended to concentrate, people like me do the framework stuff, and then, both ministers and the policymakers move on to the next thing, and we don't think about how it's actually going to happen and play it on the ground enough.
Craig, what about you? You must be concerned about access to credit and things for businesses as part of your remit. That's a particular example, but also more broadly in the area of implementation.
Sure. I mean, I'm first of all shocked, Stephen, that you suggest that politicians don't listen to people. I'm appalled at that statement. However, what I would say is that, in terms, again, like Bryan, there's a process underway with the review of the Triple CFA, and I won't talk to that now. But what I would say is that the Triple CFA reforms were probably in themselves an attempt to regulate a regulatory failure, because we had a lot of situations in which we had predatory lending, we had poor forms of lending going on to households who couldn't afford to actually pay the lending in the first place. And, we're doing a lot of work with FinCap and with households who, have clearly had mis-selling of financial services delivered to them and to our members. And that's really, so what we shouldn't do is seek to throw the baby out with the bathwater by saying our regulation didn't work, therefore we should stop that regulation and deliver a completely different regulation. What we should recognize is that many of the problems that we have are actually the consequence of previous regulatory failings. Arguably, one of the biggest regulatory failings we have right now is the housing crisis in New Zealand, and 30 to 40 years of failure to regulate land supply, failure to regulate building demand, failure to regulate the number of construction firms that we have in the sector properly, and so to deliver the kinds of outcomes that we actually want to see. That's why I said at the beginning of it, in my speech, it's not about the number of regulations. It's about making sure that the regulations that you have are delivering on your goal. And for me, certainly, the ability to implement the regulations that we've got in New Zealand, we should learn from what we've done in the past. And I think that's where sometimes we fail a little bit in New Zealand, is we seek to regulate without seeking to learn properly why we're needing to regulate and what's failed in the past in the first place.
Yep. Sort of increased thoughtfulness. I wonder sometimes too, this will be heresy to my former colleagues, the idea of having the select committees a little bit more independent of the executive, I think would be a very worthwhile exercise. Unfortunately in our country, well, fortunately in some ways, but unfortunately in others, because everybody's aspiring to get into the executive, you don't have what we have in the UK, which is often a much more independent backbench and much more focused on scrutiny of pieces of legislation. Mike, you any views in this particular area?
I do, Stephen. Having worked both sides of the fence, of course, I've got some views on this. I suppose my first thing would be to say that what I observe is that when the private sector wants to go about doing something, it really throws a lot of resource into it. And what I've observed, having worked in government and worked as a consultant to government, and now working alongside them as a partner, is a chronic under-resourcing on big projects. But big policy projects, I mean. The sense is once the policy's signed off, it's done. Whereas, in fact, the hard work begins at that stage. So I would say that we're not great at execution as a country. I think we wing it. And as a result, I think a lot of our work is not as good as it should be. The exception to that was some of the work that we did, I think, in the late 80s and early 90s, when we did throw the kitchen sink at it in terms of resources, and we attracted a lot of talent in to do that work. I would say that we haven't done that in quite some time. So that's my comment on that one. My other comment would just be to say that we don't learn from overseas. Again and again, our parochialism is legendary globally. I've worked in foreign affairs for a while, and we are known as being hyper-parochial. People won't say it to our faces, but if they think you're an Australian, they'll tell you. We really are an island, a little group of islanders, and we don't like to learn from others, even if there's a model we can grab. And my class, I could give you hundreds of examples of this, but I've seen it happen half a dozen times where there was a piece of technology we could have grabbed from somewhere for very little money, or an idea that we could have ripped off and implemented in New Zealand. But no, we have to come up with something from the ground up that makes no sense. I say to people, it's kind of like developing your own word processor. Fun, but stupid. And we do that, I think we do that far too often. And then my final point on this, I suppose, would just be around the rate of change. We love to fiddle, we love to meddle. And to your point, there was a little book written back in the late 70s, wasn't it, by Geoffrey Palmer, that originally had a question mark, and then he got rid of the question mark, unbridled power. The reforms that were done around our voting system were actually a proxy for dealing with executive overreach in the 70s. But we didn't actually address that. So what we have is a situation now where effectively we have, as Geoffrey Palmer used to refer to as elected dictatorships. Governments come in, there's no regulatory check there really. And I think that leads to suboptimal outcomes on the quality of our work. So to your point, I do think that if there was a greater independence with that scrutiny, we'd end up with a better product. Because in the end, that's the benefit of a liberal democracy, isn't it? That's actual scrutiny of legislation is the critical piece. So there you go, there's my views.
Thank you very much. Look, I just want to change tack before we finish, because there's a big elephant in the room which is probably troubling for everybody here, and that is inflation now. And what seems to be, as an outsider looking in, and I'm not being critical of the New Zealand Reserve Bank at this point, because I think it's a worldwide phenomenon where central banks feel like they've been dovish for too long, and now we're fighting inflation from behind the eight ball. How worried are the three of you about that from a business perspective? And I'd be worried about a wage price spiral, and that's not to pick on people going for wage increases, because I certainly would, but more a case of that's the logical outcome of this, at least in the short term, particularly with a closed off labour market from the rest of the world, we've got some real challenges ahead of us. So interested in your views. Let's start perhaps with Craig and then Mike and Bryan, and then we'll wrap it up.
Thanks, Stephen. I mean, in terms of to answer your second question first, if there's going to be, is there evidence of a wage price spiral? We've got evidence of the price spiral. We have 5.9% inflation. We don't necessarily have evidence of the wage spiral to accompany it. LCI, so labour cost inflation, from memory, is 2.8% in the latest data set. And even if you take our ordinary hourly, meaning wages, it's nowhere near the current level of inflation. And similarly, when none of the forecasts see that the level of wages reaching the level of inflation in any short run scenario. I also think we also have a very bifurcated labour market. The recovery that we've seen to date in COVID is, if you have skills, if you're in demand, you're doing well, and you may well be benefiting from the recovery and from the growth that we genuinely have seen post-COVID. If you're not doing so well, if perhaps you don't have the skills that are needed in the economy, or you were in a sector that was suffering to date, then you're probably continuing to see your relative quality of life in comparison to others decline. And that K-shaped recovery that some economists talk about, I can see that certainly continuing over the time period. That's why lifts to the minimum wage are quite important in order to create a floor for that, to make sure that doesn't get as worse than it positively could be. So I don't see the wage price spiral yet. I certainly see the prices rising, but I don't necessarily see the wages rising on the other side. Do I think it's a real problem for businesses going forward? Well, to be honest, there's a bunch of economists who tell me that it's permanent, that it's here, and that inflation's out of control, and we need to lift the OCR regularly because it's a permanent issue now in the economy. And there's a bunch of economists who tell me that, frankly, this is a transient issue. This is about oil. This is about shipping costs. This is about a bunch of other things, and they'll go away once the bottlenecks ease. One of them will be right. For my money, I'm still more in team transient than I am in team permanent. But it will create real issues for businesses, even in the short run, in terms of managing costs. But right now, that doesn't seem to be having a depressing effect on economic activity. And so, it may be that one of the things you want to look at is does the Reserve Bank, with its current OCR track, see that having a depressing effect on economic activity? And from memory, the last MPS continues to see economic growth going forward. So I don't think it's a fantastic. I don't think it's the most important issue yet. I think skills, access to workers is probably the most important issue, and that's what the surveys tell us for businesses right now. But if inflation became permanent, then clearly it would be a very important issue for businesses.
Thank you, Craig. Mike, just a quick comment from you.
It'll come as no surprise that I'm very worried about it. And all you need to do is, I've got a background in development economics, and so all you need to do is look at developing countries and see that, why are they still developing? Because they've let inflation run away time and time and time again. I agree with Craig. It's one of a set of things that we need to be concerned about. It's not just one of them, but it is something we need to be concerned about. I'm confident that we've got the tools to manage it. I'd be interested in, how long is transient? I think it could be a year or two, but I am confident that we can get on top of it using the tools that we have. But I think you'd be a fool not to be focused on it, because we haven't been in a situation with such high inflation for a very long time. But I'm confident we can get on top of it. It is an indicator, though, of just how different these times are from the last 30 years. We are in something that feels a bit more like the 70s to me than it does the 80s or 90s. And that means that we're going to have to use some reasonably big tools in our toolbox to manage that, get things back on track, and then and go from there.
And before I go to Bryan, I can report from a number of companies that I work with that they're dusting off all their price escalation clauses and everything else. So it doesn't feel transitory to me at this point. Everybody's trying to relearn things that they haven't had to know since the 70s to ensure they don't get underwater with what they sell. Bryan, how big a problem?
Yep, I think it's definitely an issue. partly because we haven't seen it for a while, although I share Mike's view that we have got the tools, but it could be a bumpy road. And then 3 other observations. I think while I don't regret any of the decisions we took over the last couple of years, I think this turned out to be more of a supply side event than a demand side event. And our initial response was, what we do in the demand side thing. So that's a mea culpa, a bit of a lesson there for us. 2, on wages. Interestingly, if you disaggregate the LCI by skill level, it's the lowest and the second lowest skill levels that are seeing most of the big increases coming through in wages. So that's kind of just interesting seeing where that pressure is coming through. And 3rd, how this ultimately plays out is going to be dependent on the housing market, just given that's such a big part of our macro transmission mechanism here in New Zealand. So I'll leave it there, and a big thanks to you, Stephen, and to my fellow panellists.
Thank you, Bryan. And we had this last-minute disagreement between Bryan and Craig that we have no time to actually go back and delve into, which is, never mind, we can do that later at some point in the future. Look, thanks very much to the 3 of you for being with us today and for your insights. Highly appreciated. As I said at one point, I'm sure everybody agrees on the outcome. There's just difference of opinions on how we might get there, which is the nature of political economy. Thank you very much for your time, and look forward to seeing you again at some point soon.